Hey guys, this is a monumental moment for us and for our show and for our personal careers. Many of you, who followed us need to understand that the person who's inspired us the most, as far as we're concerned, and I think this is 100% certain, is the father of conversion rate optimization, is Bryan Eisenberg. He's in one of the screens with us today. And we don't have, when he's, for me, he's my personal hero. So I can't even have a structured set of questions for him. So what we will do is we're just going to have a freewheeling conversation. We're going to talk about the history of conversion optimization. We're going to talk about Bryan's take on the trends that have emerged over the last couple of years. We're going to talk a little bit about the future of conversion optimization. And this is really, we're just going to dig into Bryan's brain and get access to all the goodies. So Bryan, thank you so much for making the time for us today. And, we're honored to have you.
It's definitely my pleasure.
So let's get started. I want to kind of start off with my first question. So Bryan, you've written a number of books that are focused on A/B testing, conversion optimization, persuasion, which is your area of expertise. You've written, I think 2005, 2006, 2008, you've got a bunch of, bestsellers under your, under your belt. I know that these books, you were thinking about this stuff with Jeffrey much before these books came out. Obviously, the books are the culmination of those ideas. I want to understand the origin story. Like where in the timeline did you guys have this insight? And then how did it go from that insight to starting your agency to writing books? Because nobody, like at least we had you for inspiration. Who was your inspiration?
Yeah, it goes back a long time. So first of all, thank you for having me today. But Lorenzo and Rishi, it's really an honor. My first taste of optimization actually happened when I was like 13 years old, long time ago. I was hacking around with bulletin board code. And I would play around with trying to get people to go to the areas that I wanted them to go to.
Wow.
And so I'd hack menus. And I guess that was my first start. But what eventually happened was, this was in the early to mid 90s. I was in graduate school for social work. And my brother was working in finance, and he had been doing business in, I think it was something like 26 different countries over the last like 7-8 years. And he just got frustrated. And, we grew up, we didn't have any kind of relationship whatsoever. And so at some point he was like, okay, I want to do something, with Bryan, pulled me out of social work school. And we started doing some work around sales training and marketing. And we worked with one of his friends who used to work for a sporting goods company. And that was one of the first starts we had. And as the internet started blowing up early, right, we started playing around, obviously, with a little bit of SEO. My big thing, though, has always been about understanding why people do the things they do. It's why I went to social work school. And I realized that obviously, while I could, take web position gold and, tweak pages and stuff like that, that really there was an opportunity that, we weren't following normal psychological flows, right? Like I still remember very early on, one of the very first articles that we ever did was an article on, I forgot even the title of it, it's so many years, but it was about, back then, you used to find your item, okay, you get to your product page, you add it to your cart, and then it was mystery meat trying to figure out, where do I go next? Okay, it was hard to find a checkout button. There was no such thing as a continue shopping button. That didn't exist, okay? Half the time they put you, okay, I found one item, now I've got to go straight into the shopping cart and figure that out, and that was not pleasant of an experience. I mean, I could still remember the first time we ever put my dad in front of Amazon, and how he just looked like, no, I was not interested. And we realized that there was a lot of opportunity in just applying some very basic flow and changing information flow as well. and what kind of impact that could have on stores. And so we started doing that just kind of on the side. By the time 1998 came around, 97, 98, and we started going into the, the dot-com boom, we hooked up with an incubator out of New York. And this is where I got my nickname, by the way. He started seeing what we were doing with SEO, but he said, this other stuff you're doing, nobody else understands that. Like, that's what you need to do. And he was right, but it was just way, way too early.
Now, when you say the nickname, you mean the Grok, correct?
The Grok, yeah, the nickname, the Grok. By 1998, we already decided to focus the agency on just conversion optimization, which was way too early. And then by 2000, 2001, we started publishing books. Now, what we realized is that there was always a pattern of understanding how knowledge gets sold, essentially, right? At first, you start publishing, then you start speaking, then eventually you start creating software, and like there was a cycle of doing this, and we had seen other people doing this, and we're like, okay, this was pre-internet, and our first getting started with some of the very early email list groups, the iSales group, for example, and the early Adam Audette and his dad's, and I almost ended up with a job with him before we started our agency, but that's a whole different story. Everything could have been completely different. But by 2000, we had written The Marketer's Common Sense Guide to E-Metrics with my good friend Jim Novo. Not because I love data, but I realized that obviously data could help us prove the changes we wanted to make. By 2001, we knew that we needed our own book. And so we wrote Persuasive Online Copywriting. And that book became iconic. I mean, we saw versions sold on Amazon and eBay for like $3,000, $4,000. I don't even know how that happened.
Wow.
But those two books, and because of Web Trends back in the day, who was using our Marketer's Common Sense Guide to Metrics at their road shows, helped us build our platform, helped us build our audience beyond the people who had already discovered us. As you said, by 2005, we finally published the Call to Action. We realized it was time to get a real full CRO book out there, kind of touched on all the topics. And we're sitting there, and we've put out a bunch of books, and we sent out some to some influencers. And by chance, in the second week, Seth Godin decided to drop what he was doing. And he wrote a blog post, which he's now since changed, which, by the way, is interesting. But I found a screenshot of it that said, "Don't judge a book by its cover." And he basically was, drop everything you're doing and buy this book, even though he had just written a little ebook on conversion. And that put us to the New York Times bestseller list. And I think that's where CRO started getting some roots in there, because it started becoming a little bit more mainstream. And then, of course, by 2006 was Waiting for Your Cat to Bark, which became, a monstrous book.
That's, I wish, Lorenzo, I wish there was technology. We should do this where interviewers have these little sensors, and on the screen it shows how excited they are, because my numbers are jumping all off, and I'm sure Lorenzo's doing the same thing. This is just it's so fascinating. So Bryan, just so I understand, so I think, because you guys had this inordinate challenge, where we are today. Companies understand that they have a conversion problem, and they may not know how to solve it, but we can come in and say, hey, hire us, and we can in your scenario, you actually you were pre-understanding the problem. So you kind of had to first help people understand that this is a problem, and then say, hey, by the way, we also have a solution for it. That seems much harder.
It is much harder. So it's funny, because I'm talking to some friends of mine now, like, in the, fitness area, and they're doing some unique things. And I told them, it is so much harder to create a new category, because you've got to establish that, yes, there is a problem. Yes, there are solutions. And most people aren't even problem aware. And even if there's some sign of a problem, they have no way of contextualizing it, of explaining it to themselves. So there's no way to go out and search for it. And so it's one of the funny stories. Do you know why it's called CRO? Funny story in this one. So we've always hated the term, but back in the day when we were trying to be discovered for any search terms, the only thing that had any kind of search volume was the term conversion rate, because there was a lot of people searching for currency conversion rate. And xe.com was the only thing that ranked.
Wow.
Until we started pounding that term, because at least it was one of the metrics that we defined, right? Like in sales, it's common metrics. So we were like, oh, okay, we can start attacking that. There are people searching for it, because there wasn't people looking for customer experience. There wasn't people looking for, persuasion on my website. It just didn't exist, right? You barely Jakob Nielsen was around, but it wasn't like there were, and Jared Spool was around a little bit by then, but it wasn't like there were tons of people even looking for usability work.
Yeah.
Right. It was just starting out. And we're like, oh, this conversion rate's got a lot of search terms. Maybe we'll look into some people who want to find it. And so we optimized for conversion rate optimization.
Wow.
And that's how CRO finally came about.
That's really fascinating. Bryan, there is something that I want to touch on, which, and I'd love to get your take on this, because it's a very fascinating topic for me. So when I discovered you, you're the person who kind of infected my mind with this idea of this term persuasion. I had never heard the term. I didn't know what it meant. And you, for forever, whenever I hear the word persuasion, it's going to only mean one thing to me now, as it should. The other thing you just talked about was, the foundation of the business. Your brother was running a sales training business. You also talked about, conversion optimization from a sales perspective. There seems to be, and I deeply relate to this, because it's very close to my philosophical view as well. I look at conversion optimization as being a sales function to some extent. It's about persuading someone to buy. However, when I look at the CRO landscape today, and I look at the kind of experiments people are running, there seems to be a lot of focus on UI and UX and stuff like that, and not enough focus on copywriting, not enough focus on persuasion. And I want to understand from your perspective, like, it seems absurd to me that when you were talking about this stuff, and all your books talk about this stuff, like, why isn't this the default way of doing conversion optimization? And because this is the only thing I do, and I want to get your perspective on, like, why has CRO become so diffused?
Because sales is a four-letter dirty word, right? We've all seen the movie Glenn Ross. We've all seen, so many sales movies, and The Cadillac Man, one of my other favorite movies, right? And salespeople come off as this pushy thing. And when you think about an offline equivalent, right? So we have to start with that mental model first. Is we think of, okay, there's a VP of marketing whose job is to drive people into the stores, and then there's a VP of sales, and like, they don't want anything to do with the salespeople. They're icky. Okay, we don't want to touch them. Like, we don't know what they do. Our job is just we bring the people in, you go get the money, because money's dirty. And philosophically, we're trained this way, even from very young. And so when we think about copywriting and sales, like, that's really where we're coming from. Even today in the online world, UX is really feels more of a function of design and coding than it does from a sales perspective. They're not getting that training, right? There's still that VP of marketing whose job is to drive traffic, but there's no one whose job fundamentally is, how do I get sales online? No one who's going to get fired if sales go down.
Yeah, I also think, Bryan, that if we think about the landscape of marketers, 20 years ago versus now, you had to have 20 years ago, you had to have copywriting skills in order to be a marketer, right? It was a mandatory thing. Well, yeah, but it was very like direct response, kind of like a lot of marketers were very direct response kind of focused. While today, it's not like super mandatory to have those skills in order to be a good marketer.
I think it's easier to be a marketer today as well. I mean, it was harder to be a marketer 20 years ago. So the only ones that actually got into it were people who are like really really committed. Today, you can do a course on Facebook advertising, get a good job. And this is why we have crappy conversion rates.
Correct. And because the cost of traffic was still relatively low, it was not a big deal. Unfortunately, or fortunately for those who are in the persuasion CRO space, bad marketplace is where we shine, because everybody needs to optimize what they currently have, because they can't keep spending endlessly, right? And so they're going to come to us crying, saying, well, but I need to make this work with these numbers.
Yeah. And I think what's really fascinating is that today the consumer is so conditioned for, I think a lot of consumers today buy without even fully thinking. So they'll click on an ad, they'll on their mobile phone, their shipping billing is pre-populated, checkout. And of course there might be higher returns in the back end, which we don't talk about, but
a lot of the friction's been removed.
The friction has been removed. And I think it's allowed marketers to become a little more lazy and kind of play with that inertia. Whereas back then, the consumer was 99% confident they were not going to buy. So you had to work extra hard to persuade them to actually buy.
I mean, you remember in call to action, we talked about, Amazon's buttons over the years, right? And when they first started out, they used to have a lock on the add to cart button. They always had the word, you can always remove it later, because they knew how fearful people were to take any kind of action. Now, we've gotten past a lot of that. And like you said, the momentum and the friction for buying is gone. But now we're going to have to raise the temperature of our consumers. The persuasion part is going to become so much more part of the equation of persuasive momentum.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, Lorenzo, please proceed.
Yeah, no, I have a question because I've been talking to a lot of PPC people, for example. So a lot of specialists that just focus on bringing traffic from an acquisition perspective. And, based on what you said around, okay, now, in the future, more and more, especially considering all the changes happening on Facebook, more marketers are going to have to come to CRO people, crying, saying, oh, guys, you need to fix it, right? So I see in the next 5 years, a big shift from PPC towards CRO people, because it makes sense, right? So I wanted to ask you, do you have any kind of tip recommendation for those PPC people that want to make the shift from PPC to CRO?
Yeah, so the job of each one is different, right? And it's different parts of the persuasive funnel, essentially, right? The job of PPC or social advertising or even social media, for that point, right? Just putting out tweets and Instagram photos, is to grab attention, right? And that's the first step. It's okay, the skill of grabbing attention is very different than raising the temperature and making me want to take an action. And so that part of persuasion is very, very different than, you could do almost anything to grab people's attention today. You could do anything silly, anything, just novel, and you're grabbing their attention. Does it fit within your story, right? Because that has to be the first part of it. We used to be able to get away. I mean, you probably remember the old lower my bills ads on Yahoo, where they had this little animation going every single time. And that was their key thing. And God bless Matt Coffin and his crew. By the way, they were the first company to bring us in to train their whole company.
Wow.
Okay. And later on sold to Experian for oodles and oodles of money. But the key here was they understood real well how to get people's attention. But they're okay, well, now that we got their attention so well, we got them on the website. How do we raise that temperature, right, in order for them to take that action? And that needs to be a unified plan, because we've got to start getting better at telling the story and beginning the story, because there's something that's worthy of their attention in our story, in advertising, and then finish up that story. So now you've increased that desire, right, for them to want to take action.
And one of the things, Bryan, and I'd love to get your take on it. So I'm going to try and point. Okay, so if you can see my screen, you'll see that.
Yep, love it.
That is a 125-year-old Sears catalog. It's the most valuable thing I own. And I think I want to make this point for our audience, because I want them to. A lot of the people that watch our show are young marketers. They don't even know what happened in 2005. but they are thinking about what books should I read and what should I be reading. And I want to just emphasize that I personally think that all of the books that you've written, Waiting for Your Cat to Bark, Call to Action, or even though some of the screenshots from Overstock might be irrelevant, I think the principles are exactly the same. Nothing has changed about human psychology in the last 30 years.
Correct.
And so I think
absolutely correct. Yeah. It's funny because we can go back, and other than like the screenshots look like older design, the fundamental principles are always evergreen. And most of our content's always been like that. And we've purposely tried to do that. Because when you focus in on principles, not rules, right? They don't break, right? Rules break. Perfect example, right? Load time, right? We used to say what a load time was based on, at the time, like you'd be lucky if you had DSL connections. Now, people have 5G connections, and I have Gigafiber here in the house, but it's the same principle. If the page takes a long time for it to load up compared to other pages, it's going to frustrate me. I'm going to leave. Like that principle doesn't change, right? How my eyes work, right? There's a stereoscopic type of vision. There's places on the screen that naturally draw me. That's going to matter. The size of buttons, do they stand out? Are they easy to, contrast and find? Those things matter. Those things are never going to change. And back to Lorenzo's favorite, understanding how people express themselves and what's in their heads and what's in their hearts, that's not going to change. Right. Back in those books, we talked about the power of reviews early on and how to leverage them, right, to improve conversion rates. There's still so few people still do that today. It's scary. Okay. It's free money, and that nobody ever does. And you look at like the Sears catalog, and we always talk about, there's always been like 3 main drivers that drive consumer purchase change. Okay. It's financial technologies, right? So back then in the Sears catalog, there were no credit cards. Okay. You basically gave your cash to the conductor and they brought you whatever was there, right? Go back all the way to, before Roman times, and we were bartering things, right? So currency made a difference. We had coins that now had value and we can exchange. Then of course we saw the credit card. Now we're starting to see things, and again, I don't think it's ready yet, but obviously I think where cryptocurrency, NFTs, I think there's opportunity there. It's a sign that something's going to happen. The friction hasn't been removed here. That's why it hasn't been adopted. So financial currency is one thing that changes human behavior. Communication technology is the other, right? And so we went from word of mouth to our basically to our little neighborhood marketplace, to eventually we had a little local store, and now all of a sudden Sears Roebuck comes out with this catalog that ran along the train lines, and I was able to get my watch from there. And then of course came the internet, and that changed a whole bunch of things. And again, we're seeing progressions there. Shopify is a whole different creature that's popped up. Social selling has come up. But we haven't really seen the next evolution, which we'll see as we start seeing more VR and AR really find some groundness in how we interact with the world. It's not there yet, but I can see signs of it happening. And then the last one is in basically transportation, right? We used to only be able to get stuff that was local to us, right? Then there were the horses that took it to the market, and then planes, trains, automobiles started giving us a global economy. Now we're talking about 3D printers and autonomous cars, and that's going to change things. And I think when we start seeing, autonomous electric trucks being able to transport goods, we're going to see things happen very differently as well. And so when you realize those 3 main things drive change in consumer behavior, when you go back and study what worked in old mediums like the Sears Roebuck catalog, a lot of those principles don't change because the medium changed.
Exactly, right. And I really want young marketers to understand this, because in terms of innovations that happened in the last 6 months, we only have a few ideas. In terms of innovations that happened over the last 200 years, we have such a rich library of ideas you can lean on. And I don't want them to switch their mind to things that happened 200 years ago and say, I don't want to lean on that because it doesn't apply to us, because it absolutely does in a slightly different context.
If people didn't do that, we wouldn't be driving cars today, because Thomas Edison took a look at a meat disassembly line, right, where they took carcasses of beef and cut them up, and he said, wow, I wonder if I could do that in reverse and put together cars. Wisdom is wisdom, and it persists throughout the universe. It never changed. How did we get the wheel? There was a wisdom that came through that's common trends. The Russians used to have a system for studying wisdom called TRIZ, T-R-I-Z. My friend Mark, who was a former NASA scientist, wrote a book, Da Vinci and the 40 Answers. Same thing. There are techniques to understand how to study parallel industries for what they've done to reach solutions that you could always bring into new industries that haven't seen them yet.
Well, that's fascinating, Bryan. Before I got into A/B testing and stuff like that, I used to work for an ad agency, and I was the only weirdo in my office who would spend 3 hours a week watching infomercials. And all of the guys in my agency said, Rishi, we're never going to sell to those kind of companies. We want to work with General Motors. But I found it fascinating that as much as this was like below the line advertising, or whatever you want, whatever the term was, there was something that was highly effective about it. And
they were persuading people to take action, period.
Exactly. So, well, Lorenzo, I've hogged this. I'm going to have you ask the next set of questions.
Yeah, no, I was curious. You obviously wrote a great book about Amazon and e-commerce. A lot of people that watch our show are obviously into DTC. They work for DTC companies, or they're consultant for DTC brands. Do you want to briefly talk about that book? And the next question about that is, how can a DTC brand today be like Amazon without the Amazon financial resources, though?
Well, so first, remember, the subtitle of the book is "Even a Lemonade Stand Can Do It." Right? Be like Amazon, even a lemonade stand can do it. Right? It's
yep, there it is.
Up there in the corner there. And the point of it was to show all kinds of different businesses and brands that were able to leverage the same principles that Amazon has done since day one. If you've read Jeff Bezos, shareholder letters over the years, you realize it's all the same principles. And he is a great student of process and persuasion. And so he's been able to leverage this. And so when we first looked, and this comes back out of a keynote, by the way, I had originally done a keynote that was all about Apple and their success and taking their principles from watching their different commercials. Okay. And it was one of my favorite keynotes. But after I did it a few times, I realized, what, it's great, but you need a genius like Steve Jobs in order to do that. And I realized what's different about Amazon is, look, it took forever for him to raise the capital. He was competing against the largest retailer in the world, right? Walmart. Within a few years of getting started, they had no resources compared to them. When they was just selling books, again, they were competing against a behemoth that owned almost all book sales in Barnes and Nobles and Borders. Like, if you ever think you're small, just go back in history and look at when Amazon started. Okay, and he had to go through 60 meetings to raise $1 million. Like, crazy. It was difficult. But what he did is the same process. He realized, hey, I need to understand my customer and understand my customer's problem, right? In the case of books, typical bookstore could only hold about 100,000 different titles, okay? And that's not enough for what most people want. How can we get more people and find them? And then we're going to post reviews, because we're not in the business of helping people sell books. We're in the business of helping people buy books. And he realized that he could serve customers that way. And so that's the first lesson. How do you serve and become customer centric? Okay. And so I think that's the part when a lot of DTC brands think they need to be the voice of their brand, but not the voice that listens to their customer. And it's a big balance point, right? That's where reviews come in great, because you can start learning how to talk their language, right? Poo-Pourri is a great example of that, by the way.
Oh yeah, I know that brand.
Okay. Secondly, we need to take out this customer and research and understand our customer and innovate for them. What are we going to do to find a problem that we can solve for them in a unique way that helps them in unique ways, right? What are we going to do for them? Then ultimately, we've got to execute, because any brand today, you're going to try things and it's going to fail. And you're going to try more things and it's going to fail. You're going to try something, it's going to work a little bit. Then you're going to have to refine it. So how do you keep executing and build a culture of execution? Because at the end of the day, that's all that works today. Things change too fast. We're building. When we were working with Google, one of our friends always used to say, working at Google is like living on quicksand. Okay, because everything changes around you, the earth, every few days. And so you have to get used to that. And so you need a culture that executes real well. And then ultimately, you have to optimize, right? Because whatever you thought could change, could work, maybe you missed it in the execution. How do you revise it? What did you do with your resources? Was it perfect? Maybe not. Now you have a chance to improve it, because now you maybe have more resources. And so you keep that flywheel cycle going, and every brand can use that to grow. I don't care what size it is. I don't care what you sell. That process is timely, and it's a lifelong principle.
Yeah, one of the things that I'm seeing in general with e-commerce, DTC brands, there's a lot of focus on optimization, but not enough focus about innovation. And it doesn't have to be like, oh my God, I'm gonna invest hundreds of millions of dollars in innovation, right? Why do you think is that? Is it because of like they think that I got one product, one type of business model, and I will keep on doing that for forever? Or is it basically they don't have enough examples of our companies that are doing it? Like, do you
Rishi said it earlier. People are lazy.
Yeah.
People are lazy, and it's just easy to focus in and copy one and think, okay, yeah, that's a formula for success. But like, one of my friends, John Bostock, he came from Big Ass Fans.
Oh, wow.
He was the CMO there. And he went ahead and he started a cleaning supply company. Okay. And again, you're taking on the Clorox and the Johnson & Johnsons, the big companies. And he just found some unique ways to market and speak and have a different voice. And they sold that company within a couple of years. Like, wow, it works. It works. You just have to follow, I hate the rules, but the playbook.
Yeah, no, I remember, I forget the name of the company, but I know one of the things that I made a recording of their mobile page, because before the product became available, they actually had a countdown timer, which I thought was such a clever way of creating excitement and urgency. And you kind of give your email address to be notified. I loved it.
Yeah, one of my favorite example of this is actually the 5-hour energy drink. They looked at one specific, jobs to be done that the user was trying to get done. Drive for X amount of hours, and but went straight into the coffee market because they understood their customers and understood what they needed to get done and what problem they were trying to solve.
And they built a pretty nice little business.
Exactly. It's in every single, I haven't been to the US in a while, but it's in every single 7-Eleven across the country.
Yeah, and it's a Michigan-based company, so I'm super excited about that. But I love the fact that like everything about them, even though I've never bought the product before, because I don't need more caffeine in my life, but it's just the form factor of the bottle is so counterintuitive. It stands out. It's visible in stores. The name is genius. Sometimes I think when we hire brand consultants to come up with clever names, we overcomplicate things. But such a simple name like 5-Hour Energy, I already know what the promise of the product is. And there couldn't be a better name, maybe 6-Hour Energy, but
No, they had a formula. And I mean, back in my agency days, we used to have those every so often. That there could have been a supply of those because there were some late days. Glad I'm not in the agency world anymore. But yeah, no, they just told you exactly what problem they solved and how they solved it by giving you 5 hours of energy. Like, okay, great.
Bryan, do you remember the commercial, head on, apply directly to your head, head on, apply directly to your head? I just think that, while these are memeable things and they're funny, and most most agencies would never touch this kind of work. That commercial, it was so literal and so to the point that it's impossible to miss what even though I know what the product does. If you have a headache, you apply it directly to your head. If I have a headache, that's the first thing I think about, even though the mechanism they used to get my attention was maybe a little gimmicky. It still is a consideration set of one when I have a headache.
Yeah, because what they did is they anchored the problem in a humorous way. They passed basically the gatekeepers of your brain to anchor that in an interesting way, so that when you have that problem, you think of it right away. That takes a very skilled ad writer. Right. Most ad writing today is terrible. So when you see something that good, coming from my mentor who's been, writing ads for, 20 plus years more, hold on a minute. Wow. 30 plus years probably at this point. You get spoiled by understanding why ads work and why they don't.
Who's
right?
Your mentor? Who's your mentor?
He's the one who wrote our last book with us, Roy H. Williams. That was one of the books that changed our career early on, reading his Wizard of Ads trilogy.
Yeah.
He's in Austin, isn't he? Isn't there a thing in Austin?
That's what initially brought us down to Austin, in the late 90s, early 2000s. And Jeffrey and I used to drive to his facility. There was almost nothing here in Austin, little houses, with great, this piece of property, like $40,000. Like, wow. We should probably buy something, but we're both like, we'll never live here. Yeah, we were both stupid.
Wow. I mean, it's so fascinating, Bryan. No, Bryan, I don't know. I know that you've been very interested in sports more recently, but I want to understand, what are some of the thoughts that are going through your mind right now? Are you kind of like, is there anything related to conversion optimization? I mean, in the traditional sense, or what's going on? What are you up to?
We still consult, a little bit here and there, just a couple companies a year, not too much.
Okay.
We're also building a product that helps business owners of home services companies to improve the value of their company by giving them insights into the data that's running their company. Because there, again, like everything, there's lots of data. No one knows what the important pieces are of it. And so we're in the middle of building out that company. And I see the same thing in sports. And it's what Jim Novo told me when we first wrote
his book. Oh my God.
Yeah, when we first wrote The Marketer's Common Sense Guide to E-Metrics, and we'd have these conversations that he's seen this movie before. He'd always talk about this, right? That the same things we're seeing in the early internet with data was the same things he saw when he was working with Home Shopping Network and trying to get them to understand data coming in off the call center. And here I am working on trying to solve the data for the call center for the home services company, because the traditional electrician and plumber and AC guy, they don't have that background. They don't have the resources that a Home Shopping Network does or an Amazon does to look at these things. And there's a big consolidation in the marketplace right now, and companies are there are a lot of little small companies doing this, and they're trying to figure out, oh well, how can I become a slightly bigger company so that a bigger company can buy me for a good valuation and I can get out? And we're like, it's all in the data. If you understand the data, you can know exactly where your inefficiencies are, right? Optimize those and grow. And we're seeing the same thing in sports, right? There's always been a ton of data in sports, but we're not looking at the right parts of the data. And I learned how to use the data that's in sports to help my son become a college recruit, even though he wasn't necessarily the most gifted natural athlete, right? But if you understand how to optimize, it's applying the same thing over and over again.
I love it. It's fascinating, because what you're showing us is that once you understand these core principles, they apply very broadly,
Well, because steroids is a mindset, right? So it's
totally. It's funny because Rishi, you probably remember, like right after I left the agency, I lost nearly 100 pounds. Okay. Unfortunately, I put on about 30 of those. So COVID has not been friendly to me. But what I learned losing those 100 pounds is more about optimization than I did in all the years working with my clients. But it's the same thing. Like, how do you lose 100 pounds? 1 pound at a time, right? It's the daily consistency of actions, the daily consistency of making a better choice, of finding a better substitute for what you're doing today. And so, I'd go ahead and I'd lose some weight, and then, I'd plateau, and I'm like, okay, well, walking is not enough. Maybe I'm gonna have to start riding the bicycle a couple of times a week. And I started doing that, and that became riding the bicycle 5 times a week. And that started adding, okay, well, that plateaued. Now I need to start adding some resistance training. And you just keep improving. And it's the same thing in conversion optimization. You find a solution, you improve it, it reaches a local maxima. You've got to find the next iteration to innovate, to change yourself. Works in everything.
Yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I know you've got another call coming up. I won't take more of your time, but Bryan, it's been a unique privilege to have a chance. You are the first person we've spoken to, and I'm glad that it was you. Thank you so much for your time today. The wisdom and the generosity with which you've always made time. I mean, I remember sending you an email, and I always would get a response. And and we were talking about this before the show. We hope to. The reason why we had this show is we want to pay it forward as well. So thank you for everything you and Jeffrey have done for the community. And we look forward to seeing what else you have. I'm sure you're going to do some interesting things with your local services businesses, and I'm sure we can learn lessons from that and apply it to e-commerce as well.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to see, not only what you accomplish, but the people you've worked with, the people you've trained, and the people you've inspired, what they're accomplishing and providing to the community. So, keep doing the amazing work you guys are doing. You're making a difference. And, my mentor's wife very early on taught us a lesson. There's 3 things that you can do as an entrepreneur. You can make a name, you can make a difference, or you can make money. And she said, we really have to focus in on one. Like, the 3 can happen, but you got to focus in on one. And from day one, ours was always to make a difference. And we're glad to see, so many people that have been impacted, by what we put out there for all those years.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely foundational. And, I really feel like, when I did my MBA in marketing, I mean, maybe back then we didn't really have e-commerce, but today I feel like we need to have your book in those classes, because it gives you a jump start to the whole process. You don't have to be a CRO person, but these principles play a role if you're in marketing.
Oh yeah, no. So I've gotten letters even last year from one of the books, like being taught at Harvard. So wow. Yeah, it's happening. There are some professors who get it, others who don't. We'll see what happens over the next few years.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Bryan.
It's been
It was my pleasure to be here. Hopefully we'll do it again another time.
Most certainly.